Good morning and welcome to this new lecture. Today we're going to talk about the passive form, which is a little difficult topic. We're going to talk about just the first and second conjugation, and this lecture will cover paragraphs from 23 to 26 of the textbook chapter 3. Okay, let us start. So, what is the passive? So, active and passive are two aspects of one of the main properties of the verb, that is to say, the voice. So we learned earlier in the course that the verb has a voice. One of the properties of the verb is the voice, and the voice can be either active or passive. When the action is active, the subject actively performs the action in question. For example, if I say that Caesar defeats the enemies, he actively performs the defeat of the enemies. Whereas when an action is passive, the subject is the recipient of an action, or in other words, he suffers the action. In the example, there is Caesar is defeated by the enemies. In this case, it means that Caesar suffers the act of being defeated by the enemies. So the word passive comes from a Greek verb, which is pasco, which survives in Latin with the verb patior, one of the roots of this verb is pass, and so from here comes the word passive. And both pasco and patior mean to suffer, and that is why it is called passive in English. So we have already seen an important distinction between transitive and intransitive verbs, but let's review it again, because this is important for the passive form of the verb. So a transitive verb is a verb that can have an object. For example, if I say I eat an apple, apple is the object of to eat. This is important because all transitive verbs can have the passive form. And in fact, if I want to do the passive of the sentence in the example, it is going to be an apple is eaten by me, because the object can then become subject of the passive sentence. On the contrary, an intransitive verb is a verb that cannot have an object. And usually, a verb used with an intransitive meaning cannot have the passive form. For example, if I say I am running in the fields, it is impossible to do the passive, because there is no object which can be turned into the subject of the passive sentence. There are verbs, however, which can have both a transitive and an intransitive meaning. For example, if I say I'm walking in the fields, this is used in an intransitive meaning because walk doesn't have an object. But if I say I am walking a dangerous path, in this case the sentence would be transitive because a dangerous path is the object of to walk. Another important distinction is synthetic versus analytic. So in English, in order to do the passive, you usually need to form a form of the verb to be plus a past participle. There are many ways in English in which you can form the passive, but the minimum thing is a voice of the verb to be plus a past participle. Therefore, to form a passive, you need a minimum of 2 words. So if I say Caesar is defeated by the enemies, of course, I have 2 words. A big difference with Latin is that in Latin, the passive form, for the simple tenses, which are the ones that we are studying, requires just 1 word. So while in English I say Caesar is defeated and I use 2 words, in Latin I'm just gonna use 1. So Caesar profligatur ab inimicis, and profligatur is just 1 word which translates is defeated. So usually a synthetic form is a form in which you use not many words, while an analytic form is a form in which you use multiple words. So as I write here, a verbal form which requires many words is called analytic, from the Greek verb analuo, which means to dissolve or to divide, while a verbal form which requires few words is called synthetic, from the Greek verb syuntithemi, which means to put together. English is a pretty analytic language because in order to form verbs, you need a lot of words. For example, in English you have a lot of modals. So the verb can, will, would, should, might, and you always have to use them if you want to form different tenses and moods of the verb. For example, in English, if you want to do the conditional, you have to say, I would like to. While in Italian, for example, you just use one word. So in Italian, I would like to is just translated with vorrei. So this means that there are some languages who are more synthetic or more analytic than others. For example, Latin is a very synthetic language because in Latin, the simple tenses of the passive voice are synthetic, so they are just made in one word, as we said before. So, in order to learn the passive forms, it is necessary to learn a new set of personal endings, but they are comparable with those of the active form. So, for the active form, we have o or m, st, mus, tis, nt. For the passive, there is or are, ris, tur, mur, mini, ntur. As you can see, they are kind of similar. So you can actually relate the active with the passive. Here is an example. So I chose two verbs. The first verb is amare, to love, and the second verb is tenere, to hold. So I'm gonna read the present passive of all of them. Amor, amaris, amatur, amamur, amamini, amantur. Teneor, teneris, tenetur, tenemur, tenemini, tenentur. As you can see, the endings are kind of relatable to the ones of the active. I also put a translation next to it because I think it might be useful. Here, as you can see that the stem is always the same. The only thing that changes are the personal endings. So this means that once you learn the personal endings, you basically have learned the passive form. In the case of the present, you just need to take the stem and add the personal ending. For the imperfect, the reasoning is similar. For the imperfect, you have to take the stem, of course, you have to add the infix ba, and you have to put the personal endings of the passive form. I'm gonna read the passive form of both verbs. Amabar, amabaris, amabatur, amabamur, amabamini, amabantur. Tenebar, tenebaris, tenebatur, tenebamur, tenebamini, tenebantur. Here, the thing is similar. Once you take the stem and you add the infix, the only difference is to change the personal endings, and then you will have formed the passive. The future is slightly different from the imperfect and the present because here we can see that sometimes the theme vowel changes. But the formation of the future is similar to the active verbs. So you just need to add the infix be and the passive personal endings. I'm going to read the future passive of both verbs. Amabor, amaberis, amabitur, amabimur, amabimini, amabuntur. Tenebor, teneberis, tenebitur, tenebimur, tenebimini, tenebuntur. Here there are a couple of exceptions. For example, the second person singular is not amabiris, but it is amaberis. And this is an exception that unfortunately you have to memorize. All of the other forms are kind of the same. Even for the passive, we also have this archaic ending for the third person plural with the bu. So it is not amabintur, but it is amabuntur, like amabunt for the active. Same thing for the second person singular of the second conjugation. It is not tenebiris, but it is teneberis. Another important concept is the ablative of agent. So when an action is performed, it is generally performed by someone. While English has the preposition by to express the person by whom the action is performed, Latin has a or ab plus the ablative. So if I say the apple is eaten by me, in Latin you will have a or ab plus an ablative to express by me. This is called ablative of agent because it gives you the agency of the person by whom the action is performed. So you could tell me that a or ab plus ablative is also an expression of location, and it expresses an ablative of place from which. So how do you distinguish an ablative of agent from an ablative of place from which? Well, this is easy because usually the ablative of agent is found when there is a passive form next to it, because the ablative of agent is typical of a passive form. While the ablative of place from which is found when there is a verb of motion next to it. So for example, if I say ambulo ab agris, of course, ambulare means to walk and it is a verb of motion, so ab agris, it is likely to be an ablative of place from which, so I walk or I am walking away from the fields. While the next sentence, Caesar profligatur ab inimicis, so profligatur is clearly a passive, and so ab inimicis is likely to be an ablative of agent. And in fact, if I translate it, is going to be Caesar is defeated by the enemies. Last thing for today is that there are a couple of verbs that switch their meaning from active to passive. The first one is video, to see, because the passive videor means to seem or to look like. Videor, if you have an adjective with videor, it becomes a predicate adjective. So if I say Marcus videtur bonus, Mark seems good or seems a good person, that bonus is going to be predicate adjective because it's an adjective related to the subject. The second verb is habeo. Habeo, with the active form, means to have, while with the passive form, habeor means to be considered. So if I say Marcus habetur bonus, it means Mark is considered a good person. And similarly, bonus will be a predicate adjective. Another thing is that videor can also have a complementary infinitive to complete the meaning of the verb. So if I say videris amare bellum, you seem to love war. So in this case, amare would be a complementary infinitive. Okay, this is everything for this lecture. I hope that everything was clear. Write your questions down and bring them to class, as usual.